As Caitlin drove away, I thought about what her dad had said about her mother being like Caitlin when she was that age. He said he had tamed Colleen, but I suspected that it was their love for each other that was the secret. It had been less than 24 hours since I first met Caitlin, and I couldn't imagine any man taming the fiery redhead. Supper that night was pretty much a repeat of the night before. Caitlin had conversations with her parents and Sam. I didn't really feel slighted. After all, she didn't know me and we had nothing in common really. We were just finishing dinner when there was a knock on the door. Bill went to answer it. He came into the kitchen followed by a man about my age. He was what women would call tall, dark, and handsome. Caitlin excitedly called out a name and jumped from her seat and huged the guy. It was obvious they knew each other. They were gabbing away about how long it had been since they had seen each other. A few minutes later, there was another knock on the door and Bill went and answered it and returned with another man. This one was fair-haired but also good-looking. He received an equally warm greeting from Caitlin. I recalled Bill's words about having to fend off every male for counties around to win his wife. Caitlin was every bit the prize that her mother was, at least in looks. I excused myself from the table and returned to my cabin. Mentally, I wished the two guys luck. I did envy them though. If Caitlin turned out to be the woman her mother was, whoever won her affections would be a lucky man. The next day, I took the pickup and rode the ranch. By the time I had made my rounds, something didn't seem to add up. It was early enough that I went back and got Sam, and we did a whirlwind tour of the ranch. There were a lot of cows scattered over the ranch, but he agreed that something didn't feel right. It just seemed like we were short a few head. We decided we would saddle up the next day and ride to hilly areas. We discussed it with Bill that night at supper, and he agreed to our plan. It rained at night, which would make finding tracks more difficult. The next morning, we loaded our horses into a trailer and Bill drove us to one end of the property. I rode about a third of the way up into the tree line and Sam rode another third higher. We then headed across the ranch over the hills and through the trees. It took a big part of the day to reach the far side. We counted 5 stray head. Bill met us as we came out of the hills and we loaded the horses in the trailer and headed back. We discussed the situation and decided the only thing we could do is be more vigilant. At dinner that night, Caitlin had another suitor to call on her. I heard her mother mutter something about that being the third one that day. The word had gotten out that she was back home and guys were crawling out of the woodwork seeking her attention. The next 4 days, we spent a lot of time keeping an eye on the herd. Everything seemed to be okay except for the suspected original loss. Caitlin's callers continued to visit. She had been home for a week and hadn't said 2 words to me since the day she brought me my lunch. The 5th day after the perceived disappearance of the cattle, I told Bill I wanted to ride the property line. Through the hills, we had already covered all the fence lines along the pasture areas and had seen no evidence that the missing cattle had taken through there. Sam dropped me off on the west side of the ranch. This was where Bill's ranch bordered the Wilson Ranch. About halfway to the southwest corner, I spotted 3 fresh sets of horse tracks. They crossed from the Wilson side of the fence onto Bill's side. The puzzling thing is that the fence wire was still up. I dismounted and checked the fence posts and saw that the staples had been loosened on 5 posts and were barely holding the wire up. It appeared that someone removed the staples, lowered the wire, and had put the wire and staples back up. I remounted and followed the tracks. When I got near the stream, I saw 3 horses tied to a tree. I was a little ways above the waterfall, about 30 yards away. I quickly got down, tied my horse to a tree, and pulled the rifle from its scabbard. I crept quietly through the trees, my eyes darting from side to side. When I reached the horses, I could see boot prints leading downstream. I crept to the edge of the waterfall and looked over and gasped. There was Caitlin in the pool. She was naked as the day she was born. I was mesmerized by the sight. She was swimming through the water, her nude body clearly on display in the clear water. Damn, she had a cute butt. She rolled over onto her back, her firm breast sticking out of the water. A movement in the trees to her right brought me back to my senses. I quickly scanned the area and saw 1 guy to the right and 2 more nearing the pond on the left. I raised my rifle and shot a bullet. It hit between the feet of the guy on the right. One more quick pull of the trigger and the dirt exploded between the 2 guys on the left. Caitlin released a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the trees. I stood up so everyone could see me. "On your bellies now. I won't miss the next shot," I yelled out. "Caitlin, stay where you are." Caitlin didn't see the 3 men. She only saw me standing over her with a rifle in my hands. "Are you crazy, Carson?" she screamed. She struggled to cover her naked body. One of the men on the left flinched as if he was going to run. The bark on the tree right next to his face exploded as I pulled the trigger again. He was convinced and dropped flat down. Caitlin looked to where I had shot and saw the two men. She shrieked again. I said, "On your stomachs." Before I could say one, the other two dropped down. "Now put your faces in the dirt and your hands behind your heads." They again did as ordered. "Now get out, Caitlin, and get dressed." But Carson, she began to protest. "Caitlin, just do what I tell you. Get dressed and get out of here," I growled at her. Caitlin was clearly scared, and I could see her shaking from where I was. But she did as I ordered and walked out of the pool like Venus rising from the sea. She stepped out of the water even though she kept her back to me. I couldn't take my eyes off her. The sight of her alabaster skin and the most perfectly rounded but that I have ever beheld were forever etched into my mind. She only put on her jeans and shirt and swung up onto her horse. One kick and she was gone through the trees. When she was gone, I ordered the men one by one to get up and lie back down in front of me. Only when all three lay before me did I breathe a sigh of relief. I decided it was time for a bluff. "So what am I going to do with you three?" I paused for effect. "I guess I could just shoot you in the legs and watch you bleed to death." The three men began to beg me to save their lives. I smelled a distinct scent. At least one of them had pissed his pants. "Even if I spare you, Caitlin's father will ensure justice when I inform him of your heinous intentions toward his daughter. Unless, of course, you have a more compelling confession for the sheriff. Something like cattle rustling. It may lead to jail time, but at least it guarantees you a chance at life." The smallest among them cracked. "Yes, we did it." Wilson said breaking Buckman would secure his land. Another hushed him. "Shut up, I ain't dying for damn cows." The smaller man retorted, anticipating Caitlin's swift return and her father's inevitable investigation. I opted to buy my time. True to expectation, 45 minutes later, Bill and Sam galloped into view. I signaled them down and they raced up to join me. "What in the hell is happening?" Bill demanded, perched on his horse, peering down at the three men. It appears some of Wilson's hands paid us an unwelcome visit. I tracked them from the fence line to here. Caitlin was swimming, and these three were attempting to sneak up on her. I gestured. I pressed the barrel of my rifle against the smaller man's neck. "I believe this one has something he wants to confess." He whimpered. "We did it. We took some of your cattle, but it was Wilson who forced us." Bill tilted his hat back, grinning at me. "You know, when my grandfather ran this ranch, they'd hang horse thieves and cattle rustlers. Sometimes justice seemed simpler back then. Too bad we have to be civilized these days." While Sam stood guard Bill and I decided to march the rest back down with rifles in hand. We trailed behind them, Sam tethering their horses together and bringing up the rear. Upon reaching the buildings, we led the rustlers into the barn, placing them in separate stalls with open doors that allowed us to keep watch without them seeing each other. Bill went into the house to call the sheriff while Sam and I stood guard. In under 30 minutes, the sheriff raced up the lengthy mile-long drive. I met Bill briefing the sheriff on the unfolding events. I proposed bringing the smaller culprit out first for the sheriff to interrogate, and he agreed. I promptly had my prisoner outside. Initially hesitant, the little rustler seemed to reconsider his silence and began to speak. "It appears, Bill, that we got a straightforward case of trespassing here. Honestly, it's a bit of a waste of my time, but I suppose I could leave them in your hands. Forget I saw them and let you handle things," the sheriff remarked. The frightened rustler's eyes widened and he suddenly opened up. The sheriff soon extracted the truth, calling for backup. Soon a convoy of sheriff vehicles streamed onto Wilson's vast ranch despite its extensive 16,000-acre expanse. The sheriffs pinpointed the location provided by the rustler, discovering almost 100 stolen cattle bearing the Rockingbee brand. By day's end, Wilson and his cohorts were incarcerated amidst the commotion. It was well past 9 before we gathered for supper. Caitlin, though seated at the table, kept her gaze fixed on her plate. "What were you doing up there?" Bill inquired, addressing Caitlin, as he hadn't had much chance to speak with her. "I was just taking a swim. I didn't think anyone would come spy on me." She cast me an accusing glare. "Firstly, Caitlin," I interjected, "I wasn't spying on you. I traced their horse tracks to the stream. Secondly, consider what might have happened if I hadn't been there. I doubt those three were planning a picnic when they saw you swimming naked." Caitlin's face flushed crimson. "Thank goodness you arrived when you did," Carson, her mother, remarked. "I hate to think what might have happened." The conversation shifted and we hurriedly finished our meal, aware of an early start the next day. Exiting the kitchen toward my cabin, Caitlin called out to me. I halted and waited as she snapped rudely. "So did you enjoy the view?" Expecting gratitude proved too optimistic. "Let's just say I'd be dishonest if I claimed it wasn't breathtaking." She huffed and turned on her heels, marching off toward the house. The following day, Bill had to head into town to officially file charges against Wilson. Returning the stolen cattle to their rightful place would take several days as the prosecutor needed to thoroughly document the case. First, Sam and I spent the day refreshing the paint on some of the outbuildings. We had lunch in the kitchen, but Caitlin chose not to join us, a decision that suited me just fine. Bill explained at dinner that since this wasn't a capital case, Wilson and his accomplices would be released on bail. While he didn't anticipate any further trouble, he cautioned us to remain vigilant. Bill glanced at his daughter, grinning mischievously. "If you're planning on another nut swim anytime soon, maybe you should take Carson along, for protection." He chuckled and Caitlin's face turned crimson again. She stood kicking her chair backward and raced from the room. Bill and Sam erupted in laughter, and even Colleen couldn't help but giggle. I chuckled along with them, and we resumed our meal. Bill continued his good-natured teasing. "I really want to thank you, Carson. Wilson could have seriously jeopardized this ranch financially. You're worth every penny I pay you." We all shared another round of laughter. 3 days later, Bill received the news that he could retrieve his cattle. We loaded 3 horses into a trailer and drove to Wilson's Flying D Ranch accompanied by a sheriff's escort. Colleen came along to drive the truck and trailer back once we unloaded the horses. Bill, Sam, and I started pushing the cows back toward his ranch. Feeling like characters in a Western movie on a cattle drive, we approached the Rocking Bee Ranch. I rode ahead and loosened part of the fence line, allowing the cattle to cross over. After ensuring all the cattle were back where they belonged, we secured the fencing and rode back to the main house. During this time, Caitlin had applied for her veterinary license. As the approval process typically took around 45 days, she could only tend to the animals on her father's ranch for now. I'd spot her around the property and, of course, at mealtime. Despite her continued silent treatment, sometimes we managed to meet eyes. I'd offer a big grin and wiggle my eyebrows, always enough to make her blush. 2 weeks after the waterfall incident, we found ourselves in the barn simultaneously. "Been enjoying any swims, lady?" I wiggled my eyes suggestively. Caitlin approached, standing inches away, and shot me a glare. "Why are you such an ass?" she snapped. I shrugged, grinning. "Why are you such a prude?" I retorted. She walked up to me and her right hand aimed for my face, but I reacted, swiftly grabbing her wrist before she could strike. Undeterred, she tried with her left, yet I caught that too. I pushed both hands behind her back, pinning them and forcing her body against mine slowly. I lowered my face toward hers, stopping when our lips were just an inch apart. Caitlin stared at me with wide eyes, but she made no effort to break free. "If you were mine, I'd put you over my knee and spank your cute little butt," I whispered. A loud gasp escaped Caitlin. "You wouldn't dare," she said, attempting to pull back suddenly. I released my hold, and she tumbled backward, landing on her cute little butt. "It's not that I would dare. I just got rid of one woman who doesn't care about me, and I'm not wasting my time on another one." Traditionally, Caitlin was the one to storm off, but this time it was my turn. I left the barn, leaving her sitting on the ground with her in shock and mouth open. I didn't encounter her again until supper. Predictably, she didn't speak to me, but I couldn't decipher the look she gave me. Not that I ever claimed to understand women anyway. My marriage to Janice proved that. The following day, I was in the barn tending to the stalls when Bill walked in. Knowing it was his day off on Sunday, I figured he wanted to talk. I wondered if Caitlin had informed him of the previous day's incident and if he had come to ask me to leave. I stopped my work as he approached. "I heard you and Caitlin had a little showdown yesterday," he remarked. Well, that answered my question about whether Caitlin had confided in her father, but I noticed a twinkle in Bill's eyes. "Yeah, I suppose you could say that. Probably my fault," I admitted. "Maybe not," Bill replied. "I think her issue is she doesn't know what to make of you. First, she thought you were here for something, then you became the hero who saved her and the ranch. What she can't figure out is why you aren't chasing after her like the other local young men." Like her mother at her age, Caitlin is used to having boys wrapped around her little finger. She's had a few boyfriends, but none lasted. I don't think she really respected them. I just hope you don't let her chase you off. In my book, you're welcome here as long as you want. "Thanks, Bill, that means a lot to me. As for Caitlin, I'll quit teasing her and hopefully we can live and let live," I expressed. Bill left the bar and I resumed my work. I had the rest of the day to ponder Bill's words. If Caitlin wanted to understand me, if acting civil and having a conversation would be more effective. As for pursuing her like the others, that simply wasn't in the cards. Caitlin didn't join us for supper that night, a topic no one broached, and I didn't inquire the following day. I stuck to my routine, waking up at 5 o'clock as usual. Even on my day off, I got up for breakfast. For my day off today, after Sam and Bill left for work, I retrieved my laundry. Bill had invested in a large commercial washer and dryer, making it possible for me to wash all my clothes in a single load. The laundry room was adjacent to the kitchen, so while my clothes washed, I sat at the kitchen table sipping coffee and chatting with Colleen. Caitlin entered the room suddenly, an uncommon occurrence for breakfast. Usually, she opted to eat later. Colleen asked about my plans for the day. I was thinking of driving into town. "Anything you want me to pick up for you?" I inquired. "If you wouldn't mind, there are a couple of things you could get for me," Caitlin replied. "I wouldn't mind at all," I assured her. "Could I ride into town with you?" I heard Caitlin say. I looked up in surprise. I was planning to go to the general store for a few things, and it seems like a waste of gas for both of us to drive separately, she explained. Justifying her request, "Sure, I'd be happy to give you a lift," I responded. I was still taken aback. After yesterday, I hadn't expected her to talk to me, let alone want to ride anywhere together. "I'll be leaving in about an hour and a half, after my laundry is done and put away." "Okay, I'll be ready," Caitlin said. She finished preparing something to eat and sat at the table remaining quiet while Colleen and I continued our conversation. As I stepped out of my cabin later, Caitlin emerged from the back door looking stunning in a turquoise sundress that complemented her red hair. The bare arms and shoulders revealed by the dress's straps showcased unblemished skin. She glided toward me with grace, keeping her crystal blue eyes fixed on me. It was evident she wanted me to notice her. Holding the passenger side door open for her, I watched as she slid into the car. We set off, and for the first half of the trip, she sat quietly observing the countryside. "I thought you were going to kiss me yesterday," she suddenly remarked. I glanced at her, but she seemed to be looking out the side window, and I couldn't see her face. "Well, while that may not have been unpleasant, I do have a rule about not forcing unwanted affections upon unreceptive females." Out of the corner of my eye, I saw her head spin around, and I could tell she was staring at me. Caitlin sat quietly, but I noticed her occasional glances in my direction. We pulled into the general store and we went inside. I needed to grab a couple of new pairs of jeans and shirts while Caitlin had a list of things her mother wanted. An hour later, we had everything loaded. I had one more stop to make at the hardware store for a couple of things for Bill, but it was lunchtime and I was hungry. I suggested we stop for a bite to eat and Caitlin agreed. We pulled into the same diner where I had first met Bill and Colleen. We took a table sitting across from each other and ordered our food. As we sat in silence, I began to think that perhaps I should have just gone straight to the hardware store and back to the ranch. Just then the door swung open and 3 men entered. I recognized 2 of them as the guys who had come calling on Caitlin. They made a beeline for our table, with 2 taking the seats on either side while the third stood behind me. They ignored me and started talking to Caitlin. I stood up and gestured for the third one to take a seat. I caught Caitlin's glare as I moved to the next table. When the waitress brought our food, I motioned her over and had her place my meal in front of me. I ate quickly, paying no attention to the conversation at Caitlin's table. Tossing some bills on the table to cover our meals, I stood up. Caitlin had hardly touched her food and her plate was still full. "I'm going to run over to the hardware store. I can stop back by here later and see if you're ready to go," I said, intervening in their conversation. Caitlin pushed her plate back and stood up. "No, I'll go with you. It was nice seeing you guys again, but we have to run," she said to the guys at the table. They tried to protest, with one even offering her a ride home. She declined and followed me out to my SUV. As we drove to the hardware store, she stayed in the vehicle, appearing to be fuming. The silent tension persisted as we drove back to the ranch. Soon I was turning off the highway onto the mile-long driveway. "Why did you do that?" she asked. What I replied, uncertain about what she was pointing out. Moving to the other table, she stated, "Oh, that? Well, I thought you would prefer spending time with your friends. Besides, I didn't want to be in the middle of their competition for your attention." "You really are an ass," she snapped. I kept my mouth shut as I had no desire to fend off her slaps while driving. Pulling up to the main house, Caitlin immediately grabbed what she could and went into the inn. As I walked in the back door, she dumped everything on the kitchen table without a word to her mother, then stormed out of the room. Colleen looked at me questioningly. I shrugged, saying, "I guess I'm an ass." Colleen giggled and walked over, putting a hand on my arm. "I have never seen anyone have the effect on Caitlin that you seem to have," she said in a low voice. "Guess I was born to just piss her off," I replied. "I'm not so sure about that," she said, leaving me confused. I returned to my cabin and stowed away my new clothes. I decided not to stay cooped up. I went to the barn and saddled the horse. Riding out, I ended up at the top of the waterfall. With the weather being nice, I tied the horse to a tree and sat at the edge of the falls, looking down at the clear pool, sitting there for half an hour, maybe longer. Caitlin rode up below me, getting off her horse and not wanting to be accused of spying, in case she was going skinny dipping again. I picked up a stone and tossed it down, creating a splash in the water. Caitlin looked around, seeking the source of the noise, and spotted me. Anticipating her departure, she instead mounted her horse and rode up to where I was sitting. She tied her horse next to mine and walked towards me. I stood up, taking a few steps away from the edge in case she planned on pushing me off. "You're an ass," she said, stopping inches from me, "and you're still a prude," I said. This time, I didn't wait for her slap. I grabbed her around the waist and kissed her quickly. Releasing her, I tried to move towards my horse. Her hand seized my arm and turned me back around. I was flabbergasted when she reached behind my neck and pulled me into another kiss. Our tongues sought each other and were quickly entangled. Both of us were panting when our lips parted. Caitlin looked at me with glassy eyes. We found ourselves in a passionate kiss again. As the passion grew, our clothes disappeared. Caitlin pulled me sharply toward her, and I laid on top of her. We were not slow and gentle, but like two animals. After a few minutes, she cried out in pleasure. I soon supported her by roaring. Not wanting to overpower her, I rolled to the side and gently drew her into my arms. As we gasped for breath, our bodies glistened with a sheen of sweat. Gradually, our breathing normalized and we lingered in each other's embrace. "Let's go for a swim," Caitlin whispered. We collected our clothes and we guided our horses to the pool. I admired her butt as she led the way. In the cool water, we waded in up to our chests and Caitlin moved into my arms. Her legs effortlessly wrapped around my waist, and our lips met in another passionate kiss. My desire surged and I pressed against her. She shifted until once again I found what I sought. This time our movements were unhurried. Our lips stayed locked as I entered her, and once more we climaxed together. I held her close as she trembled in my arms. The water's buoyancy prevented my legs from giving way. Caitlin rested her head against my shoulder, and I embraced her until the water's chill forced us out. In silence, we dressed, mounted our horses, and rode back down. After stabling our mounts, Caitlin came to me, wrapping her arms around my neck for another kiss. Without a word, she turned and walked to the main house. In a haze, I returned to my cabin, slipping into the shower. The hot water cascaded over me as I pondered the recent events. One thing became clear. I harbored much stronger feelings for this captivating woman than I had acknowledged to myself. I barely had time to dress for supper. Upon entering the kitchen, Bill, Colleen, and Sam were already present, but Caitlin was nowhere in sight. As we took our seats, she walked in, choosing the chair beside mine instead of her usual place next to Sam. Bill and Colleen exchanged glances while Caitlin merely smiled sweetly in response. During dinner, Caitlin chatted animatedly. Despite her parents' curiosity, they refrained from asking why their daughter was in such high spirits. After supper, Caitlin assisted her mother in cleaning the kitchen while Sam and I headed back to our cabins. Just as I had settled between the sheets, a soft knock echoed on my door. In only my boxers, I opened the door and Caitlin slipped inside, finding her way into my arms. We shared a tender kiss, and she guided me back to my bed, joining me after shedding her clothes before drifting off to sleep. In each other's embrace, the abrupt arrival of 5 a.m. prompted me to slowly reach over and silence the blaring alarm. Caitlin, still nestled against me, emitted a small moan at the intrusion of the sound. With great reluctance, I managed to extract myself from bed. I illuminated the bathroom and dressed for the day, leaving a gentle kiss on Caitlin's head before slipping out of the cabin. During breakfast, I couldn't ignore the scrutinizing glances from Bill and Colleen. I wondered if they were aware of their daughter's nocturnal whereabouts. Following the meal, I loaded the pickup for another day of setting fence posts. Working alone on a ranch afforded ample time for contemplation. My thoughts drifted to my recent past, astounded that only 3 months had elapsed since leaving my wife. It felt like a lifetime. I contemplated on the significance of Bill, Colleen, and Sam in my life, and then my musings shifted to the beautiful Caitlin and the shared moments from the previous day. I pondered the possibility of finding the kind of love her parents embodied. At lunch, I realized once again that I had forgotten to bring my meal. As the thought crossed my mind, I heard a pickup approaching. In haste, Caitlin jumped out, running toward me with a bag in hand. She threw herself at me, initiating a passionate kiss. "Mama said you forgot your lunch," she giggled. Disregarding the meal, I pulled her in for another heated kiss. Although I didn't set as many fence posts that day, I did set my post in her a couple of times. Amid our moments of passion, we also found time to talk. I divulged the details of my former life, recounting how my ex-wife had betrayed me. Caitlin admitted her fear that I might leave. "Caitlin, all I can say is that the only way I will leave is if you tell me to go." She eventually returned home, and I finished my day's work after showering and changing. She was in the kitchen when I entered, once again choosing the seat next to mine. Midway through our meal, a knock sounded at the front door. Bill answered it and returned with the same guy who had been the first to call on Caitlin. Remaining seated, Caitlin looked at him, her expression unreadable. "I was wondering if you'd like to go for a drive," he suggested. In this part of the country, where options were limited, going for a drive was essentially a euphemism for going on a date. "I appreciate the offer," Caitlin responded, "but I don't think my boyfriend would like it." She leaned over and planted a kiss on my cheek. Mr. Tall, Dark, and Handsome blushed and stammered before making a hasty exit. With that exchange, our relationship was now out in the open. I glanced at Bill and Colleen, noticing smiles of approval. Even Sam sported a big grin. We had officially become a couple. In the following days, there were no more visits from local men calling on Caitlin. She made it clear that she was not available. Later, I found out that Caitlin had plans to seek a loan from the bank to purchase the necessary equipment for her veterinary business. The bank was hesitant to offer an unsecured loan, and the only option was to have her father put the ranch up as collateral. She was reluctant to ask him. I suggested giving me a couple of days. I might have a solution. I contacted my offshore bank, setting up an account under the guise of a fictitious loan company. Caitlin filled out a loan application on my computer, which I had set up to route to my email. After waiting a couple of days, I sent her notice that her loan had been approved and a wire transfer would be made to her account. Caitlin was thrilled by the news, but questioned why the loan only carried a 2% annual percentage rate. I explained that they were a nonprofit philanthropic group providing loans to those they believed would contribute to the community. While I could have simply offered her the money, I knew she was too proud to accept it. Having earned her degree through hard work, she was determined to succeed on her own terms. By the time her license was approved, she had purchased a new van and transformed it into a mobile vet office complete with necessary medical instruments. Once word spread about her license, status calls for her services came in from local ranchers. Many nights Caitlin spent with me in my cabin. While Bill and Colleen were aware, they seemed to have no objections. At 27, Caitlin could make her own decisions. It took 3 months for Wilson and his crew to face trial. The case was relatively straightforward. The smallest guy cooperated with the prosecution, receiving 2 years probation without prison time. The 5 other hands working for Wilson each got 5 years in prison. As the mastermind behind the rustling, Wilson received the maximum sentence of 10 years and a $50,000 fine. When Wilson was taken to prison, I initiated an investigation into him and his ranch. I discovered that he was single with no family in the area, and with all his hands incarcerated, there was no one left to run the ranch. This led me to formulate a new plan. However, before setting it in motion, I needed to address some unfinished business. I had to finalize my divorce. The thought of Janice getting half my money was not something I could accept. To achieve this, I turned to my friend Jake, seeking his assistance once again. Instead of sending an email, I called him and asked him to talk to Janice. I wanted him to convey that I had reached out and wished to propose a settlement in exchange for a divorce. The offer was a straightforward $50,000. If she declined, she would never hear from me again, and she would not receive any money. Initially playing innocent, she demanded to know why I had left and why I wouldn't return. The charade ended when Jake revealed that I knew about her affair with Brandon and her intention to divorce me. With her game exposed, Janice, still working as a waitress and struggling financially, accepted my offer to proceed. I needed to return to Texas and engage a lawyer to draw up the divorce papers. Caitlin wasn't thrilled when I informed her of my departure. I explained that I needed to close that chapter of my life and assured her that I would return. Initially planning to leave my vehicle in long-term parking at the airport, Caitlin insisted on taking me and being there upon my return. Leaving behind my SUV and most of my belongings except for what fit in one suitcase seemed to ease her concerns. I departed on a Sunday, and upon my arrival, Jake picked me up at the airport. Staying with him and his family, I made sure to call Caitlin every night. By Friday, all the paperwork was sorted out. Jake took Janice to my lawyer, explaining that she would receive a check for $10,000 immediately, with the remaining $40,000 paid in 60 days after the divorce was finalized. She signed the papers, and my lawyer handed her a $10,000 check. I never had to face Janice. Then came the realization that I had personal items in storage, keepsakes and heirlooms from my parents' yearbooks and other sentimental belongings. Not wanting to return for them later, I rented a moving van and loaded it up. Caitlin was initially taken aback when I revealed I wasn't flying back, but once I explained that I was bringing back everything important to me, her excitement about my return grew. It took me 3 days of relentless driving to cover the 1,600 miles. As I pulled into the Rocking Bee Ranch on Tuesday evening, I was greeted with an enthusiastic welcome from everyone that night. Caitlin later continued to extend her warm welcome until the early morning when we finally fell asleep, thoroughly exhausted. With the first part of my plan accomplished, I was now ready to put the rest into action. This involved making several trips to the prison where Wilson was incarcerated. My goal was to persuade him to sell me his ranch. Initially resistant, I continued to present my case. I pointed out that he would be imprisoned for at least 7 years, and even with good behavior, he wouldn't be eligible for parole. With no one to tend to his ranch, his house, and buildings, things would likely deteriorate. His cattle might perish without proper care in the winter. I also raised the question of whether he would be welcomed back into ranching country after his conviction. Faced with the prospect of ruin, he eventually accepted my offer, providing him with cash money to start over. The next step was securing financing. I moved my money back into the country, confident that Janice wouldn't jeopardize her $40,000 by taking any rash actions. I negotiated a price of $5 million with Wilson, which was below the property's true value, making it relatively easy to find financing. I made a down payment of $500,000 and financed the remaining amount. It took a month to finalize everything. I kept my activities a secret from everyone except Caitlin and Bill. I explained to them that I had personal business related to my assets that needed attention, although it consumed only 1 or 2 days of my time per week. I set up a corporation and registered the land under its new name. With summer ending and fall setting in, I hired someone to harvest the hay on the new property. Additionally, I employed 4 hands to live on site and manage the ranch in the interim. The most experienced hand was appointed temporary foreman. I clarified that for a while I would be an absentee owner despite my close proximity. I assured him he could always reach me by phone, and I planned to visit the ranch frequently. The final element of my plan involved remodeling the main house, a 2-story, 5-bedroom structure in need of modernization. Despite Caitlin's frustration with my secrecy about my activities, our relationship continued to thrive. My love for her grew each day, and I sensed that she felt the same way about me. Meanwhile, her veterinary business flourished, requiring her to be on the road frequently, but she remained content and happy. It reached a point where I nearly spilled the beans to Caitlin about what I was doing. After returning from checking on the remodeling, she cornered me with questions. "What the hell is going on, Carson? Are you seeing someone else?" she demanded. "God, no. I swear there's no one else. I just have some things I need to take care of. Please believe me. I promise I'll tell you everything soon. I love you, Caitlin. I'm asking for you to trust me. Trust in our love." Caitlin scrutinized my face, searching for the truth, and her eyes softened. "Okay, Carson, I do trust you. But you better tell me what's going on soon, or I'm going to kick your ass," she warned. I grabbed her and kissed her with all the love I had. As spring arrived and the main house renovation was complete, it was time to execute the final part of my plan. One afternoon, when I had Caitlin all alone, I asked her to go for a drive with me. I told her, "I've been thinking that it's time for me to leave the Rocking Bee Ranch." I said this to her with a serious expression. Instantly, her eyes welled up with tears. "But Carson, you promised you wouldn't leave," she said. Her chin was now quivering. I had timed it so that we were at the entrance to Wilson's former ranch now, without a sign over the gates. I turned in and started driving down the private road. "Well, I wasn't really planning on going far," I said. Caitlin looked around, clearly confused. I'm not sure she had heard what I said. "Carson, what are we doing on Wilson's land?" I delayed my answer until we pulled up to the main house. "Come on, I want to show you something." I got out of the truck and went around to open her door. Taking her hand, I led her up to the front door and opened it. "Carson," she hissed, "what the hell are you doing? We could get in trouble for this." "Relax, honey. Wilson doesn't own this ranch anymore. Let's look around. I want to know what you think about the house." Caitlin stared at me, shaking her head, but allowed me to guide her around the house. I took her upstairs and we walked through the bedrooms, then back downstairs. There was a large living room, a nicely paneled den, 2 rooms set up as home offices, and finally the kitchen. I could tell by her face that she loved the new kitchen. There was only 1 room with furnishings, and that was the one I intended to use for my office. The rest of the house awaited her decision on how she wanted to furnish it. "What do you think of the house?" I asked her. "It's really nice," she replied. "Do you think you could live here?" Damn it, Carson. What the hell is going on? I could see she was confused and getting upset. I dropped to one knee and put my hand into my jacket pocket. "Caitlin, Wilson no longer owns this ranch." "I do. I'm asking if you could live here. Could you live here as my wife?" "You own this?" she asked, with wide eyes? I nodded yes. I then took the engagement ring out of my pocket and held it up. Caitlin, I love you with all my heart. Will you be my wife? Caitlin's face scrunched up and her eyes filled with tears. At first, I thought I had made a mistake until she tackled me onto my back and covered my face in kisses. Yes, Carson. Yes, I will marry you, she shrieked. Our next kiss was filled with passion. Caitlin then presented me her finger so I could put the ring on. She looked around the house with new eyes running from room to room and examining everything. I patiently waited until she came running back into my arms. The house is beautiful. I love it, she said enthusiastically. I led her across the room to 2 doors that opened to a hallway. There are 2 offices, one for you to run your business from and one for me, I said, earning me another long kiss. I led her into the office with the desk and pulled out a large piece of paper. It had a drawing of a property gate and over it said Double C Ranch. Caitlin looked it over and her brows furrowed. What is the Double C, she asked. That stands for the Carson and Caitlin Ranch. I saw the light bulb go on. Oh my God, that's perfect, she cried. She started pulling at my clothes and I joined in stripping hers off. We then christened the office. In the days to come, we made love in every room of our home. Once we had recovered and dressed, I told Caitlin it was time to go tell the parents. She was so happy that I think she fainted a little. We got back a few minutes after 6 and Bill, Colleen, and Sam were already in the kitchen for supper. We walked in together and Caitlin held up her left hand. We're getting married, she squealed. Colleen jumped up and ran over to hug her daughter, while Bill and Sam came and pumped my hand and pounded me on the back. I then got a big hug from my future mother-in-law, while Caitlin hugged her father and Sam. When things calmed, we all sat down to eat. Caitlin waited until everyone was eating to say, of course this means we will be moving. She said this as nonchalantly as possible. What, exclaimed Bill, Colleen, and Sam in unison. Tell them, sweetheart, Caitlin said to me. I nodded. Well, Bill, you know how Wilson wanted to combine his ranch with yours? I was thinking it could be a good thing. Bill stood up looking furious. There is no way in hell I'm going to sell my ranch. I laughed. Bill, calmed down. It is no longer Wilson's ranch. It's the Double C Ranch and the new owners are sitting at your table right now. What the hell are you talking about? He shouted, now totally confused. I bought out Wilson and now the ranch belongs to Caitlin and me, I explained. Double C Carson and Caitlin, Colleen said. She got it right away. Bill, I thought if we combined the 2 ranches you could run them. We would split the profit 50-50, I added, but the Double C is over twice the size of my ranch. It brings in a lot more profit, he said. Bill, you have done this all your life. I need your help. I would like us to be equal partners. You would be in charge of the operations. What you say goes. Besides, it is part Caitlin's ranch too. It will be keeping everything in the family. Bill sat down and looked at Colleen. She nodded her head. Bill stuck his hand across the table to me and we shook on it. Damn it, Carson. This is going to take some getting used to, but I accept your offer. This means we're going to have more hands to oversee, and that means Sam will be a head foreman, I said. I then groaned, and now I get to pull out all those fence posts that I worked so hard to set on that side of the property. Everyone laughed at me. Supper that night was a loud and boisterous celebration. Caitlin spent the night in my cabin and wore me out. We were late for breakfast the next morning, but everyone was still in the kitchen when we came in. They were waiting for us to eat so we could all drive over to the Double C. Caitlin showed off our new house. Everyone was impressed, and I saw Colleen stare jealously at the refurbished kitchen. It took Caitlin and her mother a month to furnish the house. It was ready to move into on our wedding night. We were married on the Double C Ranch. Bill and his family were respected and well-liked, and ranchers and their families for miles around came to celebrate the day. As Caitlin's husband, Bill's son-in-law, and the new owner of the Double C Ranch, I was welcomed into their society. Late that night, we finally got to bed. We stayed there making love that night and most of the next day. On our 3rd day of marriage, I took my bride to Fiji for a tropical honeymoon. Our first roundup that year paid off well, and we sent a lot of cattle to market, making a nice profit. A significant portion went to pay off the loan, but with Caitlin's business, we were making a comfortable living. We even built a nice new house for Sam, and he now has a girlfriend close to his age who lives in town. We may be having another wedding soon. Another year has gone by, and my beautiful wife has just given me the most fantastic news. She's pregnant. We're going to have a baby. We're driving over right now to tell the future grandparents. One final word before I go. I know there are those who will say I should have learned my lesson the first time and had Caitlin sign a prenuptial agreement. If so, then you really haven't gotten to know my Caitlin. She isn't Janice. She works hard at her job and takes care of our home. She is her mother's daughter, and she shares her love with me every day. With me and only me. Every day that I look into her blue Irish eyes, I see that love and feel so thankful that I stumbled across Bill and Colleen that day in a random diner. Thank you for listening to my story.